You awaken before the first light to the distant call of a heron from the nearby marsh and the breath of cold air slipping through the cracks in the wooden shelter. Inside the relay station, a small cluster of felt-roofed yurts anchored beside a worn stretch of the Imperial Post Road. You are one of the few still conscious. You lie on a low bed of straw and horsehair, your deal cloak folded neatly beneath your head, your reins coiled beside it. Outside, horses stamp and snort in their paddocks. Steam rises from their blankets as they shift in the chill. This is the Mongol postal relay station, the Yam, and you are the link in a chain designed to carry messages across thousands of miles, mountain passes, deserts, and frozen rivers. Your job, like your ancestors, is simple and sacred. Carry the imperial message swiftly, faithfully, always passing it to the next runner without fail. But this simplicity hides a world of quiet routine, constant preparation, and small acts of resilience. The horses here are not pets. They are tools, meticulously cared for, yet expendable. You treat each one with professional attention, checking hooves for stones, brushing with coarse hair, loosening girths, and feeding small scoops of oats. Each second you spend matters. An extra minute delays the message. You know this, but there is no hurry to panic. There is only controlled motion, efficiency shaped by centuries of usage. As you rise, you follow the same patterns every day. First, a ladle of room temperature water, thick with barley husks, poured into a bowl and placed where your fingertips can reach it. You drink quietly, your breath fogging in the cold morning light that seeps through gaps in the wall. Then you check the horses. One has a bruise from yesterday's ride. You soak it with tea made from wild herbs that numb the pain. A mare balked twice on the rocky ridge. You soothe her with soft words in Mongolian, the language itself holding comfort. These are not heroic deeds, but they shape survival. By dawn's faintest light, you are mounted and preparing to ride again. Your boots creak softly against the wooden platform built for this transition. Horses in, horses out, note passed, stride maintained. You approach the relay master, a weathered man whose face is chiseled by sun and cold, whose voice never rises above a calm bark. He hands over the scroll, wrapped in leather and tied, sealed with red wax bearing the stamp of the Kargan. You accept it with careful hands, unseal, and glance at the script. It is a list of names, burdens of tax, instructions for movement of troops, a single sentence about horses and grain being taken north. The words are mundane, but they are everything. You saddle up, check the binding, and click your tongue to your mount. The mare steps forward, hooves clattering against wooden planks. A minute later, you are trotting across the courtyard, horses chewing straw nearby as the station begins to stir. A boy yawns at the door. An older rider emerges from his yurt, pulling his deal closed. The world is waking, and within minutes, your silhouette will recede into the fading darkness of the pre-dawn road. You ride north. The horizon is still dull, grey. A thin moon sinks low. The air smells of damp earth and dung. Each breath tastes sharp. Your pulse is steady. You carry nothing else. No pack, no weapon, no comfort beyond a cloth wrapped around your throat. You are minimal, as always. The road ahead is rocky and uneven. The mountains loom to your left. A river glitters icy and shallow. You guide the mare over stones deliberately, knees gripping lightly, reins steady. Each step must be managed. Too fast, and the horse would jolt, risk injury. Too slow, and you risk missing the next relay window. The balance is subtle, constant. Around you, the world is still. No villages, no smoke from hearths, only the steady ticking of hooves and your own breath. A lone bird calls far off. The silence is not empty. It is full of expectation. You glance at the seal again. The dispatch comes from the central court. You cannot read the names, too small, carved in fluid script, but you see the date, the day before. That means someone rode east yesterday, someone rode west today, and someone will ride east tomorrow. You are part of this relay, this living continuum. Halfway to the next station, you reach a small clearing where the relay horses are tethered. A young rider is leaning beside his mare, wiping sweat from his brow. He sees you, doesn't speak, just nods. You dismount. He pulls off the old leather pouch containing the same scroll. You slide it into your saddlebag. He slides into your arms the new one. No words, no ceremony. Ritual enough. You mount again. The mare resettles beneath you. The reins are handed back, and you rise into a slow, rhythmic trot. The day brightens. Colours shift from grey to pale browns and dark sparse grasses. The road softens in light. The mare quickens, soon a gallop, steady and sure. You sit just behind the withers, feel the momentum, but you control it. The message must not jostle loose. Bones must hold. By midday, you reach a ridge crest. You stop for water, just a bowl from a small stream filled with gloved hands. You pause your horse, wiping its muzzle. You do the same for yourself. A mouthful of water tastes cold, but it settles the stomach. You unstrap a flatbread from your wagon bag, the same bread your mother baked over morning coals. Crumbly, cold, slightly sour. You eat slowly. The food sustains, but it is not rest. You open the scroll again, scan the words to remind yourself of contents. Memorization helps keep it safe. Then, your eyes flick beyond the message, to the distant valley where the next relay awaits. A handful of yurts and horses, smoke drifting from a tiny hearth, visible only if you squint. You mount again, adjust the saddle. You feel the mare's ribs beneath your leg. You press your heel once. Then the rhythm begins again. Hoof, hoof, hoof. At some point, light shifts. Shadows bend across the road. The sun edges higher. The valley takes shape. Riders gesture and point. You reach the station. You will dismount soon. A flask will be filled. A bowl of broth offered. You will hand the scroll over and receive the next one. You will ride again, endlessly, until distance and gravity catch up. This is not glory. It is far more essential. It is trust. Your effectiveness binds the Kagan's empire together. No bullet, no diplomat, just horseflesh, wind, and discipline. You imagine your life if you stopped, the relay chain broken, the message delayed. A small delay here, another there, and orders would not be enforced. Grain shipments held, taxes late, armies stalled. But you know no empire survived without this chain. A crow caws from a distant tree. The next station will be within sight soon, and the dispatch there will be expecting you. The scroll rests against your thigh. You press your palm to it. It is cold, stiff leather, but not unfeeling. And so you gallop toward your next handoff. What runs through your mind as you ride? The urgency of the message, the health of the mare, the ache in your saddle-weary thighs, the chill that seeps into your bones with each passing hour. These are the questions that follow you, horse to horse, station to station. So I have to ask, if you were riding this path, knowing empire depended on your steps, but never seeing the grandeur, what would you be thinking about in the cold wind? You're back at the same relay station, the same faded timbers, the same low wind brushing over the grasslands, whispering past cracked wooden beams and bundles of dried reeds stacked against the wall. The yurt next door still leans slightly to one side, its canvas patched with thin strips of leather. If you didn't know better, you'd swear time barely moved in this part of the empire. But inside the station, the passing of days is marked by hoofprints, smoke stains, and the careful sorting of satchels filled with messages. This was not a post office as you might imagine it today. There were no queues, no clerks behind desks, no glass windows or postage stamps. There were, instead, rows of hand-carved pegs for hanging documents, wrapped in oilcloth or bundled in hide, and bowls of ink thickened with soot and charcoal dust, left beside bone-handled brushes worn from daily use. The writing was done in Uyghur script, Persian, Chinese, and Mongolian, the voices of a multilingual empire stitched together on pieces of hide, silk, and bark paper. The rhythms of this place were quiet but exacting. Each station, spaced roughly 25 to 30 miles apart, was timed to the endurance of a single horse at full gallop. That distance, a half-day's ride in cold weather, less if the wind was behind you, was not chosen at random. Mongol planners, with their deep knowledge of terrain and climate, selected these spots based on grazing availability, water access, and their ability to shelter messengers without delay. Over 1,400 such relay posts existed at the height of the empire, and every one of them had to function like a cog in a machine, because delays in one meant bottlenecks across thousands of miles. Inside the post, a record keeper sat cross-legged near the hearth. He had no official uniform, just a sheepskin jacket, charred at the hem from years of squatting too close to fire, and a reed-stitched ledger filled with arrival times, names, and destination markers. Sometimes he used tally stones. Sometimes he scratched notes into dried birch bark. Rarely he spoke. It was not a place for conversation. It was a place for waiting, and waiting meant listening. The wind often carried word of an approaching rider before the hooves could be heard. A faint thump, sometimes rhythmic, sometimes scattered. You would hear it in the soft clatter of harness bells or the grunt of a tired pack horse. The dogs, half feral and half domestic, usually barked first. That was the cue. Everyone to their stations. The handler would emerge from behind the hay piles, holding the reins of a fresh horse already saddled and sweating, not from exertion, but anticipation. Horses here were not pets. They were equipment, rotated, groomed, and fed with the same precision as any piece of military supply. A courier might ride in covered in dust and barely pause before swinging from one mount to the next, accepting a ladle of sour mare's milk as the only refreshment, and galloping away again with a fresh wind in his cloak. And then it would be quiet again. The silence in between was perhaps the most defining characteristic of life at the station. You might imagine it filled with storytelling or songs. Sometimes, perhaps, there were those things. But often, there was simply waiting. For the next rider, for the next scroll, for the next bundle of imperial orders wrapped in blue silk and sealed with beeswax. And the weight of responsibility in that waiting was heavy. Inside the storage chest near the hearth, beneath a woolen blanket and a piece of carved bone, were documents that, if lost, might cost lives. A requisition list for troops in Samarkand, a reply from a Chinese governor about bridge repairs, a scribbled update from a captured scout reporting frostbite and low rations near the northern passes. These were not dramatic messages, but they were vital. The Mongol Empire moved not only by conquest, but by coordination. And this system of relay stations, called the yam, was its nervous system. You begin to notice patterns in the deliveries. Every 3 days, a sealed packet bearing a hawk stamp arrives from the west, always under guard. Every week, a bundle wrapped in sheep's wool is passed to a rider headed toward the steppe, containing diplomatic gifts. Bracelets of jade, perhaps, or feathered caps. The packaging is as meticulous as the contents. One mistake in labeling, and the parcel could travel in the wrong direction for 300 miles before being noticed. And so, every station maintained a code. symbols drawn on tags made of horn or slivers of wood. The staff had to memorize over 100 such markers. And if that wasn't enough, weather added another layer of challenge. The wind in winter carried ice needles that bit into exposed faces. Riders sometimes arrived with frost-encrusted eyebrows, their beards stiff with frozen breath. In spring, mud could slow the relay by days, not because the horse couldn't travel, but because the messages had to arrive dry. Every station stored rolls of waxed paper, beeswax paste, and spare wrappings for repackaging wet scrolls. A good station was judged not only by how quickly it passed messages, but how carefully it preserved them. Now and then, a more peculiar rider would pass through, a Persian envoy on his way to China, bringing a letter written in gold leaf on indigo parchment, or a Buddhist monk carrying prayer wheels and letters for temples beyond the Gobi. The relay stations saw them all. Warriors, spies, pilgrims, surveyors, and even scholars sent to collect census data. The yam was not just for military orders, it was for anything the empire needed to move fast, from poetry to grain orders, from tax records to requests for saddle repairs. Yet, despite its precision, the relay was not without failure. A sick horse, a stolen bag, a storm that destroyed 2 yurts and scattered messages into the steppe. When those things happened, a replacement system kicked in. Nearby shepherds might be paid in salt to deliver emergency messages. Even the blacksmiths, often stationed at larger relays, could be enlisted to carry word to the next post. This decentralization made the network resilient, and the empire knew it. And so the day passes like this. Quiet observation, momentary motion, long periods of stasis. Horses breathe mist into the cold air. Porridge thickens on the fire. A rider arrives, his face unreadable under layers of dust and wool. He takes a satchel, drinks a mouthful of kumis, and disappears again into the flat, endless horizon. And as the fire burns lower, you begin to wonder, in a world without clocks, without instant transmission, how did trust survive across thousands of miles? How did they know that messages wouldn't be tampered with, or misread, or lost? What guarantees did the empire rely on, when all it had was a handful of yurts, some tired men, and horses pointed toward the edge of the world? By the time the first pale hues of dawn crept across the plains of Mongolia, a postal rider had already been awake for hours. You might imagine such a morning began with dramatic gallops and heroic launches into the horizon. But the real beginning was far quieter. It was marked by the rasp of rawhide being pulled taut, the squeak of a leather strap tightened around a saddlebag, the soft grunts of horses being nudged from slumber, and the hissing of water heating over coals in the corner of the stations. Humble yurt, Mongol postal riders, or Erturkin, were not glamorous men, nor were they warriors, at least not while they were on duty. Instead, they were part of a system that prized punctuality and reliability over flair. The relay stations were designed so that no man had to ride more than a few dozen kilometers before passing the message on to the next courier. This meant that, contrary to the modern ideal of the lone postman conquering hundreds of miles, the Mongol Empire's communication network relied on efficiency, not endurance. And yet, for these men, every kilometer had its own weight. Each morning began with the preparation of the horses. The standard Ertur station was provisioned with between 10 and 50 horses, depending on its placement along the imperial routes. These animals were not bred for beauty. Short, muscular, and shaggy, Mongol horses were built to endure cold nights and punishing distances. Riders selected their steed not out of affection, but pragmatism. Which horse had eaten well the day before? Which one had the least swelling in the joints? Which seemed the most alert in the pre-dawn hush? If you stood at the threshold of the station, you'd see a quiet bustle. Someone boiling fermented mare's milk into a sour, steaming broth. Another mending a cracked hoof covering with sinew thread. A third running their fingers across a sealed leather pouch. checking for any signs of tampering. The postal pouch, you see, was sacred. Its contents were not to be opened by any hands but those ordained by imperial decree. Even a glance inside could be interpreted as treason, punishable by a severity that echoed the empire's respect for information. So, once the horse was chosen and the rider cinched into his layered felt coat, he received the pouch. The handoff was rarely ceremonial, just a curt nod, perhaps a reminder about a weathered bridge or flooded river crossing ahead. And then the rider was off, not at a sprint, but at a measured trot, always conserving the horse, always watching the horizon for signs of smoke, other riders or storm clouds. Mid-ride, things could go sideways. Snowstorms would sweep in with little warning. Wolves occasionally stalked the trails, especially in harsher winters. And though bandits knew better than to rob imperial postmen, the consequences were often swift and fatal. The risk wasn't zero. In the rare case of confrontation, riders were trained to abandon everything before losing the pouch. The horse could be replaced, even the man could be mourned, but the message had to survive. Sometimes, it wasn't danger but dullness that gnawed at them, the monotony of the same paths, the same greetings, the same cramped yurts and endless steps. The messages themselves were sealed, anonymous, often bearing nothing more than the imperial stamp. The rider never knew what he carried. News. Of war perhaps, or a request for grain, a summons, a reprimand, a marriage arrangement, a death, all weighed the same in the pouch. On certain days, the routine was broken by visiting dignitaries or envoys, sometimes foreign emissaries moving along the same route under imperial escort. These visitors were treated with deference, but rarely warmth. The relay riders didn't have time for chatter. Their job was movement, not diplomacy. Some stations maintained brief logs, a scrap of bark or hide with charcoal markings, denoting time of departure, name of rider, and condition of the route. These fragments rarely survived more than a few months. Mice chewed them, snow dampened them, smoke smudged them into oblivion. But in their brief existence, they told a living story of the system's pulse. You might wonder what they ate. Not much and not often. A rider might carry a small pouch of dried meat, hardened curds, or roasted barley meal. If he had time, he'd take a sip of salty tea brewed from brickleaf chunks. Meals were brief, taken only if absolutely needed, and always with one ear turned toward the trail. They ate not out of pleasure, but preservation. The same could be said of how they slept. The yurts were always warm, not cozy, just warm. Blankets of felt layered on top of each other insulated the rider's bedroll, which was little more than a mat tucked into a corner, sometimes shared with another off-duty courier. Privacy was a luxury. Silence, on the other hand, was respected. No one questioned the need to sleep. Sleep was survival. By late afternoon, a rider was expected at the next station. A brief exchange, sometimes no more than a wave and a handing off of the pouch. If his horse was unfit for a return trip, he would rest and wait. Otherwise, he turned around. Same trail, same cold, same clouds curling along the horizon like smoke from an unseen fire. What made him do it again the next day? Not glory, not gold. Certainly not recognition. Most riders died without a name ever recorded in any chronicle. And yet the system endured for generations, feeding the pulse of an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the edge of Europe. What then held them to this quiet, dusty, tireless routine? You wake to the slow flicker of orange on stone, the same flame-dancing light that marked your slumber. The hearth has burned low in the night, and the dry steppe wines have crept in. Under the doors, your cloak smells of ash, your hair holds the sleep scent of oiled felt. As you sit up, bones stiff from straw bedding, the sound of snorting horses begins again, low and muffled through the thick mud brick walls. Outside, the light has not yet broken the horizon. The vast Mongol sky remains an indigo sheet, waiting for dawn's seam to split it. You pull on boots, dry, cracked, lined with rabbit fur, and step out into the frostbitten air. Today is neither festival nor battle, neither birth nor death, just another morning of waiting, another morning of tending, watching, recording. The unglamorous machinery of empire continues its quiet churn, and you are a single cog. Relay station attendant, guardian of the yam. At this hour, you are alone with your duties. The others rise slowly. The night groom who keeps the spare horses limber, the cook who reheats millet, the old man who remembers when the Khan's father rode through in silence. You gather the tools of routine, a chalk tablet to track arrivals and distances, a horn of water for brushing horsehide, a square of dried hide to keep your fingers from freezing against metal. In the relay yard, the animals shift and grunt. Most are Mongol ponies, sturdy and unremarkable, bred for hard gallops and harder terrain. But one, the dappled gelding from Samarkand, is a favourite. He arrived 3 moons ago and has not once bitten. You pat his side, then begin your slow check of the tack. Leather worn from miles, buckles frost-dulled, stirrups smooth with use. No rider has yet appeared on the horizon. You know they come. Always they come. Some ride with dispatches from Karakoram, brittle scrolls tied with wool thread, bearing the seal of a minister or a cousin of the Khan. Others carry small packages, coins, dried herbs, a child's woven toy. One man brought only silence and eyes red from days of gallop. He stayed less than an hour, changed horses, and vanished again into the dust. But until the next rider crests the low hills to the west, you are a caretaker of stillness, a manager of boring tasks in a system built to never fail. You return to the ledger room. It smells of soot, ink, and sheep glue. On the table sits the logbook, not paper, but cured bark pages bound with string. You trace the entries, dates, names, cargo, distance, horse number, time of arrival. Each is a detail forgotten by history, yet necessary to its operation. There is pride in this, even if no one thanks you for it. In a quiet moment, you recall a story the cook once told, about a relay post east of the Altai Mountains, where a message arrived 7 days ahead of schedule. The man who delivered it was never seen again. The story ends not with his death or reward, but with the post continuing, unchanged. This is the way of the yam. No single rider matters more than the route itself. As you write, the light shifts slightly. The sun at last has begun to rise. You allow yourself a spoon of warm goat milk and a torn piece of barley flatbread. Steam curls from the cup like the smoke from a soldier's campfire, thin, ephemeral, destined to vanish. Then a shout comes from the gate. One of the boys, the thin one with frost-chapped cheeks, yells that a flag has been spotted far to the west. You rise, cup abandoned, and move toward the viewing tower. It's little more than a platform on poles, but high enough to see. Through the morning haze, a figure emerges. Hunched over the saddle, wool robes flapping, horse legs dark against the snow-glinting earth. You begin preparing the fresh horse. Every part of this dance is known to you. The station must be ready before the rider arrives. Water must be heated to loosen frozen reins. Saddle straps must be loosened, new ones tightened. Grain measured, nosecloth prepared. It is the same every day, and yet each moment holds weight, for the chain cannot break. By the time the messenger enters the yard, panting and covered in dust and sweat, your horse stands ready. You take his reins as he dismounts, his hands stiff with cold and exhaustion. He speaks a name and a distance. Kanbalik, 9 days. You nod and lead him inside to rest, handing him a mug of salted broth. He does not speak again. You pass him a fresh riding cloak and a second pair of stirrups. His horse, now unsaddled, is led away to the drying pen. In moments, he swings onto the fresh mount, adjusts his pack, and without a word, disappears back into the horizon. You mark the log again. Rider, 7632. Origin, Kanbalik. Cargo, sealed packet. Condition, fatigued. Departure, 10th hour of the rooster. There is no applause. Only the wind, only the fire relit, the logs repositioned, the next set of oats measured. You think again of the thousands of other posts like yours, spaced across half the continent. Each one repeating your motions, each one invisible in the annals of kings. Yet without them, the letters would fall silent, the orders would arrive late, the empire, so vast and restless, would stumble. As the afternoon stretches on, snow begins to fall, light at first, then heavier. The next rider may be delayed, or may not come at all. You pull the shutters closed and begin to prepare the night. Meal, dried radish soup and millet again. Outside, the wind moans low across the open plains, like a tired song sung too often. You find comfort in the routine. The scratch of brush on hide, the sound of boots on packed dirt, the flicker of flame on stone. There is nothing heroic here, no tale of glory. But it is through these moments, repeated endlessly across wind-worn miles, that history moved, that the world changed, and so you keep waiting. One horse at a time. You are awake again before dawn. There is no rooster here, just the slow turning of the stars and the memory of what must be done. The silence is whole, broken only by the soft exhale of horses and the faint clatter of distant iron. Even the dogs have not stirred. This is the hour when the station feels most like a tomb, not for the dead, but for forgotten labor. A place sealed in time by dust and necessity. Today is inventory day. The YAM system, so legendary in scope and speed, depends on the mundane. There must be enough horses to spare, saddles without tears, lashings that hold under strain. You must count, record, inspect. You move room by room, oiling the hinges, marking dried ink, testing wheels on the baggage cart that hasn't moved in weeks. In the corner of the feed room, a bolt of fabric has begun to rot from the bottom. Water seeped in during the last storm. You sigh and make a note in the margin of the day's record. There will be no replacement for weeks, maybe months. You know how to patch it with old felt if you must. From the stable yard, one of the junior attendants calls for you. A new horse refuses to eat. You leave the ink still wet on the ledger and make your way outside, breath already fogging in the cold. The horse is young, from the northern line. Its eyes roll uneasily and its legs tremble. You crouch, checking the hooves for cracks, the teeth for sores. The boy who brought it stands to the side, arms crossed against the wind. He says nothing, neither do you. Eventually, you ease the animal back toward warmth, wrap its legs in felt strips, and whisper a song your grandmother used to sing, something about wind ghosts on the grasslands. The horse calms. A little. You make a note. Not fit for travel yet. There is no reward for attention to these details. No medals for keeping a coughing pony alive. But still, you do it. You all do. The others. The boy, the cook, the watchman who cannot see more than 10 paces now. Each plays a part. Each breathes life into this forgotten node on the Empire's invisible spine. Later that day, a courier arrives. A woman this time, clad in thick felt armor and a belt of knives. She carries 2 letters and an imperial tally stick. Her horse is soaked with sweat. She says little, only asks for a new mount, fast fed and already saddled. You nod and hand her warm broth while another boy prepares the horse. Before she leaves, you glance at the wax seal on the letters. The mark is unfamiliar. Not the Khans, not the usual bureaucrats. It might be from a provincial commander or a lesser noble. Either way, it will pass through your hands and be gone. You will not know its contents. You do not need to. After her departure, you sit on the threshold of the station and rest your arms on your knees. The sun is high but pale, giving little warmth. You wonder, not for the first time, how many messages move through here each season, how many orders, how many lives are shifted, a soldier redeployed, a wedding arranged, a warning delivered too late. What you do is not heroic, but it is essential. Sometimes riders stop for longer, when their horses go lame or their feet blister from frostbite. You keep a side room for these rare guests. The walls are lined with thin mattresses, each one stuffed with straw and smelling faintly of horse sweat. In the evenings, you sometimes hear them talk in sleep, babbling, shouting, whispering too. Mothers or enemies long gone. One told you once, through cracked lips and a fever, that he saw 10 postal stations burn in a single month. Bandits, rebels, weather. The empire is vast, he said, but not invincible. You remember that, though you never told the others. There are rumors, now and then, that the route might change, that this station could be closed, its duties passed to another node, one closer to the shifting trade roads. You do not let this thought stay long. The yam has existed for generations. You believe it will outlast you. Still, that night, while cleaning the grain scoops and rearranging the medical herbs, dried ephedra, horse balm, powdered root, you begin to pack a small bundle, just in case. Nothing much. Your ledger, a curved knife, a folded prayer cloth from your mother. It feels foolish, even as you tuck it beneath your bedding. Outside, the wind picks up again. You hear the creak of roof slats and the scrape of dry snow against the shutters. Inside, the fire warms the backs of your knees as you write down another tally. Horse number 11, not feeding. Monitor closely. Bolt cloth, spoiled. Guest room, occupied for 3 hours. You pause. In the margin, you scribble a small symbol. A circle, with a line through it. It means nothing official. It is yours, a quiet signature in a life that leaves few. Your days are a pattern, a repeat of tasks so well known they blend into one. But each breath you take, each log marked, horse-soothed, message received, is part of a web so vast it can only be called empire. And so, beneath a wind that never stills and a sky that does not care, you go to sleep once more. Will the messenger tomorrow bring orders from the Khan himself? Will the station remain or vanish like so many others? You do not know, but you will be ready. At long last, the final winter months began to give way to a cautious spring, and though snow still clung to the hills and shadowed the low steps, the cold had lost its sharpness. The winds that once whistled through the cracks in the station walls softened to murmurs, and even the horses stood quieter, lifting their heads more often to the rising sun. In the postal relay station at the edge of the Mongol Empire's endless roads, the rhythm of life remained steady, as it always had, but now tinged with the promise of change. It had been nearly 2 decades since Batu Khan had extended the relay system westward during the invasion of Europe. The station, once built with haste and urgency, now stood as a weathered but vital node in an empire whose arteries of communication stretched over 10,000 kilometers. And while cities rose and fell and Khans came and went, the yam riders still mounted fresh horses in silence and galloped away, just as they always had. On this morning, a young postmaster's apprentice named Timur was assigned the task of copying an inventory list, a tedious but crucial duty. The inkpot was frozen from the night's chill, and the parchment curled at the corners, refusing to lie flat. He leaned over the wooden table, his breath fogging the page as he carefully recorded. 2 jars rendered mutton fat, 1 box iron nails, 25 horses, 4 lame, 7 worn saddles, 15 letters awaiting dispatch. Outside, a fresh rider had just arrived, wind-bitten, his beard crusted with ice. His horse steamed, nostrils flaring, as it was led away to the stables. The rider offered no words as he dismounted, only handed over a small leather pouch to the postmaster before heading to the sleeping quarters with slow, deliberate steps. The pouch contained 3 letters, each sealed with a different emblem. One bore the stamp of a Chinese merchant syndicate, another from a court clerk in Samarkand, and the last, surprisingly, had no seal at all. It was simply folded, tied with coarse string, the parchment darker than most. The postmaster, Oglin, furrowed his brow at this. Letters without seals were rare. Even minor officials used them. He set the strange letter aside to review it later and turned back to the more familiar documents, reading them aloud for the apprentice's benefit. "You see, Timur," he said, in his gruff, whispering voice, "some of these letters carry more than just words. This one here," he pointed to the merchant seal, "likely carries news of spice routes opening in Bengal. And this one, taxes, always taxes." Timur nodded, not because he fully understood, but because he'd learned that nodding was the quickest way to move things along. He was more interested in what happened when letters were lost or undelivered. A quiet curiosity, never voiced. Did they vanish into the folds of the empire? Did someone still wait for them? After midday, a caravan appeared on the southern horizon. It was a rare sight. Caravans typically bypassed the yam stations, preferring the market towns. But this one was unusual. A single cart, pulled by 2 exhausted oxen, stopped near the water trough. A man climbed down from the driver's bench, elderly, wrapped in 3 coats, eyes like old glass. He bore no official documents, but he asked for shelter for the night, and Oglun, out of either weariness or kindness, agreed. The man spoke of his youth in Karakoram, of a time when the Khan's court had sent edicts with golden seals. His voice crackled like dry leaves, but he carried an air of respect. He had once been a scribe, he said, then a courier, then a man forgotten by both. "I remember when the roads were new," he said, sitting near the hearth, stirring tea with a twig. "We were proud to carry news. Now it is only the horses that remember the routes." That evening, the strange letter was finally opened. Not by Oglin, who had forgotten, but by Timur, whose curiosity had burned steadily all day. Inside was no formal message, but a short note. "To whomever rides west, tell her I waited until spring, then I rode alone." It was unsigned. Timur stared at the note for a long while, holding it near the firelight. Was it a message of farewell? A promise broken? A final confession carried not to a destination, but merely to the wind? No one else seemed to care. The postmaster had fallen asleep in his chair. The elderly traveller was mumbling about wolves. He folded the note again and tucked it into the pages of an old ledger. Perhaps someone would find it one day. Perhaps not. Spring brought mud, and with the mud came the chores, cleaning the stone, culverts, repairing the worn wooden thresholds, shaking the fleas from the straw bedding. Life resumed its cycle. Riders arrived, horses were fed, grain was measured, tea was boiled, and hooves drummed the steps once more. A new set of saddlebags arrived, lined with rabbit fur, finer than what was typical for the station. The Empire, it seemed, was sending more luxurious supplies to its interior stations. Some whispered it was because the great Khan had received troubling news from the west. Others said it was simply because the empire was flush with silver. Oglen shrugged at both explanations. "Let them send what they like," he muttered. "It doesn't change the mud." Evening fell, and the station quieted. A single lantern flickered in the stable, casting long shadows across the walls. The horses, now full with oats and hay, shifted quietly in their stalls. A rider slept, boots still on. Timur returned to his ledgers. The elderly traveller had departed in the morning, saying nothing. Timur paused over the ink, listening to the silence. He wondered again about the letter. He wondered how many others like it had passed through this station, carried not for the empire's glory, but for small private truths, unnoticed, unread, lost in the margins of the world. He wondered, and perhaps you will too, how many voices of history have drifted into the steppe wind, carried one horse at a time. The evening air carries the scent of warm stone, crushed gravel, and worn leather. You are not a Roman general, nor a senator riding in triumph. You are a worker, barely noticed, your hands caked with lime and clay, your tunic streaked with dust. As you walk toward the edge of the construction site, this stretch of road somewhere, outside the city of Nemausus, in what they now call southern Gaul, you see how ordinary it all looks. A ditch here, a pile of rocks there. But this, they've told you, is meant to last 1,000 years. And it will. Most people think of Roman roads as marvels of design, straight lines cut through mountains, drainage systems still visible, stones, worn smooth by centuries of travel. But the truth is duller than that. These roads lasted not just because they were well designed, but because they were built by thousands of hands, repeating the same slow, exhausting steps over and over again. And this section of the road is still in its beginning stage. You begin with a rut, not a metaphorical one, an actual trench carved deep into the ground, 1.5 feet, sometimes more depending on the soil. You're one of the diggers, using a long-handled iron pick, swinging low, splitting the clay and pulling it aside. It takes hours just to clear a few feet. The other labourers mutter, sweat, occasionally sing. The overseer walks past, counting, under his breath. Most of the men here are not Romans in the civic sense. They're auxiliaries, slaves, prisoners, or conscripted locals. Some speak only fragments of Latin. Others are Gallic, or Berber, or Thracian. Few will be remembered. Fewer still will ever walk the full length of the road they're building. You wonder sometimes what lies at the end of it. The layers come next. First, a base layer of the biggest stones, irregular jagged rocks pulled from nearby fields. These are packed into the trench with wooden mallets. Then comes a finer layer, gravel and crushed limestone, then sand, then smaller stones, laid with care, edge to edge, like puzzle pieces. And finally, the paving stones, flat slabs cut from local quarries, laid on top like the skin of something ancient and breathing. Every layer is pounded down with wooden rammers and wetted slightly so the dust forms a paste, a kind of primitive cement. You can see your own footprint harden in the lime before the next man hammers it flat. This is not glamorous work. Your back aches from bending. Your hands are blistered from hauling baskets of stone. Sometimes, on rare days, you find a bronze, coin buried in the soil, lost by a traveller perhaps, or left as an offering. Most of the time, you find only ants. The engineers, the grammatitsi, appear occasionally with their tools. They carry long staffs, plumb lines, square frames. They speak in quiet tones and move their hands in practiced gestures. They measure angles and gradients, deciding where the road should slope and where it should remain level. You do not speak to them unless they ask, but you watch them, curious. Their tools seem almost magical. Once, one of them explained to a group of curious workers how the road was crowned, higher in the center, sloping gently to the sides. This, he said, is for rain, so the water will run off, so the road will not flood. You nodded, though you weren't sure why that mattered. Later, you saw how, after a storm, the center remained dry while water pooled along the edges. That stuck with you. They talk often of the Vie Publicae, the public roads, of how this stretch will connect to another and another until you can ride from Lugdunum to Rome without once leaving the stones beneath your feet. It sounds impossible, but you know it is true. A legion marched past 2 weeks ago, following a road built before you were born. You remember how they moved. Disciplined, purposeful, their iron-shod sandals tapping rhythmically on the paving stones. You watch from the side of the road, dust clinging to your arms, a basket of gravel at your feet. No one in the legion looked down. Sometimes you think about the people who will walk this road in the future, merchants with carts full of amphorae, priests carrying relics, or travelers on pilgrimage. Will they know how many of you labored here? How many died? How many names were never carved into stone? There is a saying the overseer repeats often. The road is not for you. It is true in every sense. You will not travel it. You will not profit from it. But it will outlast your bones. That, he says, is enough. Later that night, as you sit by a low fire near the edge of the work camp, you clean your hands with sand. The fire crackles. The sky is black. Someone is telling a story about a man who fell into a quarry pit and was never found. Someone else sings quietly in a dialect you don't recognize. You look at the stone beside you, the one you will help lay tomorrow. It seems ordinary, just a piece of rock. But in time, horses will trot across it, carts will rattle, sandals will scrape. It will become part of something so large, so permanent, that people will think it always existed. But you know better. You know every road begins with someone breaking the earth open. And so you wonder, how many others, across the empire, are doing exactly what you're doing now? The sun had not yet risen above the Sabine hills, but already men were stirring along the length of the Via Flaminia. Soft footsteps moved across frost-bitten ground. Mules shifted in place, their harnesses clinking faintly in the pale half-light. Somewhere nearby, the scent of damp earth, lime, and hot bread mingled in the morning air. By the time most Roman citizens were still curled beneath their woolen blankets, an army of labourers was already awake and at work, inching the road forward, stone by stone, day by day. It's easy to imagine Roman roads as monolithic projects, directed by patrician engineers and executed by faceless, silent workers. But the truth, though less dramatic, is far more layered. The worksite of a Roman road was not a quiet place. It buzzed with overlapping rhythms, orders shouted in coarse Latin, chisels clinking on stone, wagons creaking under their loads, and at times, bursts of laughter between long stretches of labour. Section 2 focuses not on emperors or military generals, but on the arms and backs that carried the empire forward. The navvies, slaves, freedmen, and contract workers who built and maintained these roads, often without ever knowing how far their work would stretch. Each crew was typically divided into small units, called centuriae, not unlike military cohorts, with around 80-100 men per team. Oversight fell to a grammaticus or a curator viarum, who bore not just the responsibility of planning, but of pacing progress. They carried measuring tools like the groma, used to ensure straight paths, and coordinated with surveyors and craftsmen. But even they depended on labourers who knew their trades by muscle memory rather than blueprint. In the early stages of a road's construction, the work began with clearing. Thick underbrush was removed, trees felled, and earth leveled by hand. Axes rang out against cypress and oak. Roots were hacked free with short-handled mattocks, their iron heads worn smooth by repeated sharpening. The soil was turned with spades, often fashioned from wood with bronze or iron tips, tools that were simple, replaceable, and essential. What followed was far more delicate than one might expect from an empire known for conquest. Roman road layers were carefully stratified. The statumen, a bottom layer of large stones, served as a base for drainage. Above it, the rudus, a compacted mixture of gravel and lime. Then came the nucleus, a finer layer of sand or crushed brick. And finally, the summum dorsum, the visible top layer of tight-fitting paving stones. Each layer served a function. Each was placed with care. This precision meant that labourers could not simply dig and fill. They had to measure depth, align width, and tamp each surface flat. Most of this work was done on hands and knees, under the watchful eyes of foremen. Mistakes had consequences. A dip too low in the rudus could mean pooling water, frost damage, and eventual collapse. Workers learned this not through written guides, but through demonstration, correction, and repetition. Some roads used local stone. Others imported durable volcanic rock from nearby quarries. Hauling was slow and unglamorous. Carts creaked along temporary access paths, dragged by oxen whose hooves wore deep grooves in the earth. Even their slow pace had to be coordinated. Bottlenecks in supply could delay weeks of work, so storage pits were often dug alongside the road, filled with pre-cut materials that had been waiting silently for their turn. Food, too, was part of the logistics. A road crew didn't operate on discipline alone. Grain allotments, dried figs, salted fish, and cheap wine were common fare. Portable ovens followed the labourers, and sometimes so did families of the freedmen. A Roman road project could last seasons or even years, depending on its scope. For some workers, this was not a temporary assignment. It was a way of life. Even the laying of the final stones, the part most people today might imagine when picturing building a Roman road, was rarely dramatic. Large paving stones were lifted into place with levers, sometimes with simple block and tackle rigs. But mostly, it was about weight and patience. The stones were placed like a jigsaw, tested for fit by foot and eye, then packed with sand or gravel between the cracks. The work was backbreaking, but it had rhythm. One former legionary turned labourer is recorded as saying that building roads was more tiring than the march, but less dangerous than war. For many veterans, this labour was a path to security. The empire offered land or coin in exchange for steady work. For others, especially slaves, there was no promise beyond the next meal. What truly makes Roman roads remarkable is not just that they were built, but that they were maintained. Section crews, often based in small outposts or mansions, were assigned to check stretches of road regularly. They patched cracks, cleared debris, and relayed stones if the freeze-thaw cycles of winter warped the surface. These were not heroic acts. They were obligations. But they added decades, even centuries, to the life of the road. In fact, one of the secrets behind the longevity of Roman roads wasn't superior materials or brilliant engineering. It was institutionalized maintenance. Local communities were often required by law to contribute to road upkeep. It was written into the civic framework. If a segment fell into disrepair, blame fell not just on the workers, but on the town itself. By embedding maintenance into the civic order, the Romans didn't just build roads, they taught people how to live alongside them. The road was not just a means to travel from A to B. It was a living artery, requiring care, vigilance, and coordination across generations. And yet, when walking today along a fragment of Roman paving, surrounded by weeds and silence, it's easy to forget all. of this. Easy to think of it as a relic rather than a story still unfolding beneath the dirt. How many hands touched that stone? How many backs bent beneath the same sun that lights it now? And how much labor disappears the moment it's no longer seen? Dust never fully settled on a Roman road. Even long after the final paving stone was laid and the tools packed away, the road itself was rarely still. A completed road was a channel for movement, not just for marching soldiers and swift messengers, but for everything more mundane: grain shipments rattling toward a river port, a mule dragging limestone for a temple in the next town, a woman walking barefoot with a basket of olives. The road transformed the quiet places it passed through, and the transformations weren't always fast or dramatic, but they were lasting. Let's settle now alongside one such road, perhaps the Via Emilia, stretching through the northern plains of Italy, or the Via Appia, curving past olive groves and abandoned tombs. The year is somewhere between 140 and 90 BCE. You are neither soldier nor senator, just someone living in the shadow of stone. Life beside a Roman road was both convenience and nuisance. It meant more trade, more travelers, and sometimes more trouble. In places where the road passed close to towns or villages, temporary markets would sprout up, especially near way stations. These weren't the grand marble fora of Rome, but loose gatherings of vendors with clay pots, flapping tents, and low carts offering lentils, tunics, ointments, and gossip. An innkeeper might keep a pen of tired donkeys out back and a steaming pot of lentil stew over a low flame, waiting for the next dusty traveller in need of a warm seat and watered wine. But for every exchange made easier by the road, there were also new tensions. The road brought soldiers, yes, but it also brought tax collectors, imperial inspectors, and occasionally thieves. To discourage crime along major routes, Rome stationed small watchposts at intervals, little more than huts with 2 or 3 armed men, usually veterans paid just enough to stay loyal. Their presence was meant to discourage theft or sabotage, but in reality, most trouble was too small and too fast to catch. Local farmers learned quickly: never travel alone after sunset, and never assume a stranger with clean sandals was trustworthy. Still, the road brought opportunity. Small villages began to specialize. One might become known for its wheelwrights, another for the strength of its mule teams. A potter living near a busy junction might ship his goods not just to nearby towns, but to port cities hundreds of miles away. This wasn't globalization, not quite, but it was an early skeleton of it, a vast web of labor, trade, and supply, facilitated by roads and quietly driven by those who walked them. Some places became permanent fixtures in this web. Mutationes and mansiones, the official rest stops, were established at regular distances, maintained by local contracts or military oversight. Mutationes were small and functional, a place to change horses or grab a quick drink. Mansiones were larger, places where travelers could sleep, eat, repair wagons, and hear news. If you worked at a mansio, your life was an endless rotation of unfamiliar faces, strange dialects, and half-finished conversations. Someone always arriving, someone always leaving. But for every organized outpost, there were unrecorded, makeshift rest spots. Sometimes a shady tree, sometimes a ruined villa now occupied by squatters. Roadside shrines often appeared, little piles of stones, wooden icons, or carved images of Mercury, the god of travelers. Offerings were made, a coin, a bit of bread, a drop of oil, hoping for safe passage or simply out of habit. These small gestures, never formally recorded, helped maintain a sense of connection and continuity across the vast empire. Travelers might not know the road ahead, but they could trust it was walked by others who had left their prayers behind. Alongside all this activity, Another class of workers quietly moved from station to station. The road inspectors, known in later periods as agrimensors or simply mensors. Their job was to survey and report on the state of the roads, whether stones were loosening, drainage ditches were clogged, or bridges weakening. Some used odometers, complex carts with gears that dropped a pebble into a box for every mile travelled. Others relied on pacing, chalk, and wax tablets. They weren't glamorous figures. Most travelled alone or with a single assistant. They lodged with locals or in barns, but their reports kept the system alive. If the inspectors found a problem, a maintenance crew might be dispatched, sometimes from miles away. These weren't full construction teams, just groups of 4 or 5 workers with carts, tools, and knowledge passed down through repetition. Their work wasn't praised. There were no ceremonies for a repaired culvert, but each repair pushed back collapse for another few years. Years that allowed soldiers to march, letters to arrive, and markets to function. Over time, this constant use reshaped the landscape in quiet but profound ways. Roads carved lines through valleys and over hills, changing animal migration, altering water flow, and redirecting commerce. Old footpaths were abandoned. New ones emerged, linking distant fields to the main roads. And as the decades passed, the roads didn't just connect the empire, they defined it. Even in places where the road fell into disrepair, its memory lingered. Farmers ploughed around the old paving stones. Children played in roadside ruins. And travellers, unsure of the best way forward, might still follow the ancient curve of gravel and dust, choosing the known path, even if it no longer led where it once did. But not all roads were built equally. Some suffered from local mismanagement, corruption, or poor terrain. Others were intentionally neglected after military campaigns ended, and some stretches were simply unlucky, built atop landslide-prone hills or through marshes that swallowed foundations over time. Still, the general system held, and it held in part because of something very unglamorous: record keeping. Ledgers, contracts, inspection notes, supply lists, all scratched into wax tablets or inked onto papyrus, tracked the unexciting reality of keeping a continent-sized road system running. These records were often lost, burned, or eaten by rodents. But while they lasted, they were a hidden engine behind the smoothness of movement. Someone had to count the paving stones. Someone had to sign off on gravel orders. Someone had to authorize the wages for the muleteer hauling lime. And almost no one remembers their names. As you sit here now, in the quiet of a night long removed from theirs, it's strange to consider how many people spent their entire lives not just walking on Roman roads, but living because of them. How much of history rode on top of that stone? And what remains when the stones themselves begin to vanish into the soil? The sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the half-finished stretch of road winding out toward the distant hills. The work site, though modest in appearance, was bustling with quiet activity. Labourers were packing up their tools, brushing dust from their tunics, and taking one last look at the progress they'd made that day. You might think that after a day of hauling stones, mixing mortar, and breaking soil, they would drop everything and head straight for rest. But for Roman road crews, the work never fully stopped. There was always something to monitor, something to measure, some small ritual of care and precision that made all the difference. The heart of Roman infrastructure was not grand designs or brilliant architects. It was diligence, tireless, boring, methodical diligence. In this stretch of Section 4, the spotlight moves to maintenance. We often speak of the engineering marvels of Roman roads, the way they were laid straight, the clever use of gradients, the layers of stone. But what kept them intact wasn't just the way they were built. It was how they were maintained, year after year, century after century, in silence. Every major Roman road had caretakers, known as curatores viarum and mansionari. These officials and workers were tasked not just with repairs, but inspections, logs, and local coordination. Each stretch of road might fall under the watchful eye of a different small team, often made up of freedmen, local villagers, and labourers brought in on contracts. They were not engineers in the classical sense. They were stewards, quiet guardians of the empire's lifeblood. In the dry central provinces, they watched for heat cracks, small signs that the sun had baked the upper layers into brittle plates. In wetter climates, they hunted for creeping moss and drainage failures, where rain could sink into the substructure and rot the road from beneath. You might see one of these caretakers crouched at the edge of the road, gently scraping out a ditch with a crooked wooden tool, or carefully prodding the edge stones to see if they wobbled. It looked like busy work, but it wasn't. The survival of Rome's logistics depended on catching flaws early. Perhaps the most overlooked tool in their arsenal was documentation. Roman road maintenance crews kept ledgers, notes of wear, weather events, unusual patterns in foot traffic or cart usage. These were stored at way stations and passed up to regional curators, who often used them to petition for more funds or conscripted labour. The records were dusty, repetitive, filled with small notes like slippage noted near milestone XCC or culvert weakened after rains. But in their persistence, they told a grand story of care, of how empires aren't held together by ambition, but by the quiet work of caretaking. Even the materials for patching roads were stored with foresight. Crushed stone, gravel, lime, each had to be sourced ahead of time and stored near problematic areas. Maintenance was predictive, not reactive. You can almost picture a crew foreman squinting at the sun, judging not just the angle of light, but the dryness of the air and saying, "We'll need to reinforce this section before next spring." One of the more fascinating details is how the vehicular grooves, the ruts left by repeated cart travel, were not always signs of disrepair. In fact, in many cases, Roman road builders anticipated and even utilized rutting. By allowing slight depressions in the hard stone surface where traffic was heaviest, the roads created natural guide rails for carts. Maintenance crews would only intervene when those grooves became uneven or too deep. In this way, even wear became part of the system. The people performing these tasks were largely nameless. They didn't leave behind treatises or grand statues. Many were slaves or indentured workers. Some were locals bound to a form of civic duty. Others were paid a pittance by the state or regional governors. But every time they dug out a drain, or reset a stone, or re-whitened a milestone, they contributed to a road system that would outlive kingdoms. Sometimes the work wasn't even on the road itself, but on the systems surrounding it. Tree trimming, pest control, water diversion. In mountainous areas, they built retaining walls. In valleys, they dug drainage canals. They repaired mile markers knocked over by wind or animals. They cleaned moss from signage to ensure clarity. It's easy to imagine that the Roman Empire was held together by legions and governors, but in truth, it was bound by a million invisible acts. Acts like a man kneeling with a chisel to repair a cracked stone, or another scooping mud from a clogged ditch with numb hands. When one considers how long Roman roads endured, the initial construction is only part of the answer. The rest lies in the rhythm of maintenance, the monthly checks, the seasonal repairs, the way each segment of road was treated like a living thing in need of care. As night falls on the imagined stretch of road we've been walking beside, you can almost see them in the flickering torchlight. Figures moving slowly, shadows long, voices low. They aren't laying grand causeways or naming roads after emperors. They're patching cracks, retamping gravel, measuring stone alignment. It is the kind of work no one writes songs about, the kind of work that doesn't end in triumph. But It's the kind of work that keeps things from falling apart. What happened when these maintenance rituals faltered? What does the silence of broken roads reveal about the end of an empire? Imagine standing on a Roman road in the twilight of empire. It's not the 1st century anymore. The glory days of Caesar and Augustus are long behind. The marble has dulled, the legions are spread thin. Across the provinces, walls creak, markets quiet, and temples begin to shed their stones. And yet, still, the road beneath your feet holds. You notice how the dust shifts differently here, coarser than in the fields, compact, layered, stones worn smooth but still in place. Grass may grow between the paving, but it doesn't break through. The road still knows its purpose. In Section 5, we examine what happened as the empire began to falter, but the roads remained. Not just the stone paths themselves, but the systems around them. The way stations, mile markers, and people who kept them alive long after the central authority had faded. Even during the so-called decline, Roman infrastructure often outlasted Roman administration. Many provincial governors lost touch with Rome, but they maintained roads to keep local trade and control functioning. In Gaul, Britannia, and North Africa, the routines of maintenance endured, if altered. Not because of loyalty to the empire, but out of sheer necessity. Roads were lifelines for tax collection, food distribution, and even military defense. In places where the cursus publicus, the imperial postal and transport service, was no longer fully funded, communities adapted. Wealthy landowners near major routes took over stewardship of road segments. They paid workers out of private funds, especially when their own estates relied on smooth transportation of goods. This semi-privatized infrastructure kept the arteries open, even as the heart grew weak. The roadside relay stations, mansiones and mutationes, became quieter, more improvised. Some were maintained by retired soldiers, others were repurposed into inns or storage houses. A few were looted, their tiles and beams stripped for use in village construction, and yet a surprising number simply continued. Travelers still needed rest, horses still needed feeding. The ancient rhythm of travel persisted, even if the banners flying overhead changed. Evidence from archaeological digs reveals curious layers in these later centuries. A road rebuilt by a local bishop rather than a Roman engineer. Repairs using bricks from collapsed temples. Paving stones reset, but now out of alignment. The careful geometry of Roman design giving way to something more haphazard, more human. Still, the roads functioned. In this late period, the responsibility for maintenance often fell on colony, tenant farmers bound to the land, or on curiales, members of the local elite charged with civic duties. This was a heavy burden. Records show complaints from town councils and curators about the cost of road upkeep. Some tried to pass the duties to others, some neglected them, and in those places, slowly, imperceptibly, the roads began to fail. Where maintenance faltered, the signs were subtle. Drainage ditches filled with debris and stopped carrying water away. Moss overtook the edges. Paving stones shifted as the foundation eroded. Cartwheels bucked and wobbled. Dust thickened. Travelers diverted. Trade slowed. And like a body losing circulation, the region began to decay from the extremities inward. But even then, many roads endured. Some became buried, forgotten, and rediscovered centuries later. Others remained in continuous use, their surfaces repaved by the Franks, the Byzantines, even medieval kings. The Roman road was more than stone. It was a template, a habit of movement, a quiet idea passed along with the wind. Consider the Via Egnatia, the long road stretching across the Balkans, from the Adriatic to Byzantium. Built in the 2nd century BCE, it saw Roman legions march eastward. later gave passage to crusaders, and today much of it runs beneath modern highways. Not because of chance, but because of location. Roman engineers knew how to read the land, and because of those who kept it alive long after the planners were dust. What's remarkable isn't just the survival of the roads, but their invisibility. For centuries they lay under the feet of people who no longer knew their names. Only that they worked, that the path was straight, that the wagon didn't tip, that a journey begun could be completed. You can imagine a weary monk walking a cracked Roman road in the 9th century, unaware of the empire that built it, grateful for the dry footing in the rain. Or a merchant's child in the 5th century, bouncing on a cart, tracing the grooves in the stone and asking where they lead. These roads held memories, not in stories or statues, but in their usefulness. The labourers who once maintained them had no idea their work would last so long. No empire tells its ditch diggers that they are shaping history. No road mender imagines that his gravel will carry the future. Yet it did. Quiet hands held the world together far longer than any emperor's decree. And so, in these twilight centuries, Roman roads became ghost veins, still pulsing faintly with the remnants of an empire. Their strength lay not just in how they were built, but in how ordinary people, long after the glory faded, chose to keep them alive. What changed when those ordinary people stopped caring? How long does a road last when no one walks it anymore? Now, the road is nearly silent. Not entirely forgotten, just absorbed. Worn by time, reshaped by others, folded into the landscape like an old scar. Beneath the topsoil of modern Europe, thousands of Roman roads still lie intact. Some cradle quiet country lanes. Others form the skeleton of bustling cities. But most are unnoticed, used but unremembered, their original makers long gone. In this final section, we step back from the labourers and look at the full afterlife of Roman roads, how they endured, how they were inherited, and how their persistence shaped not just medieval Europe, but even the modern world. By the 6th century, much of Western Europe had fragmented. The Western Roman Empire was a memory. In Italy, the Ostrogoths rebuilt sections of the Via Appia. In Gaul, the Merovingians taxed road use and patrolled key segments for tolls. In Spain and North Africa, Berber tribes followed Roman tracks across deserts and hills, not because they revered Rome, but because the path worked. Yet what's surprising is not just that these roads were reused, but that no better alternatives emerged for centuries. Across medieval Europe, the Roman road was often the only viable route for trade or communication. Kings rode them. Monks travelled them. Pilgrims followed their straight lines through dense woods and uncertain terrain. Why? Because the Roman road was built not for a moment, but for movement. Its foundation was not just gravel and mortar, but mindset. The empire had the luxury of time, land, and engineering knowledge, and it applied those resources with an intent modern infrastructure projects rarely afford: longevity without compromise. That endurance shaped Europe's geography. Entire cities, London, Paris, Cologne, grew where roads met rivers. Forts became crossroads. Crossroads became villages. Villages became capitals. The Roman logic of placement, elevation, gradient, water access was so strong that later generations kept it without even realizing. In England, for example, many Chester towns, like Manchester or Dorchester, began as Roman forts at road intersections. The straight paths radiating outward from those towns still guide buses, trucks, and foot traffic today. In France, old Roman routes form the spine of the national road system. And in parts of Eastern Europe, Roman roads serve as borderlines between parishes, counties, and even countries. But roads do more than carry bodies. They carry ideas. It's no coincidence that Christianity spread along Roman roads. Missionaries from the east followed familiar routes into western provinces. Monastic orders established waypoints where mutations and mansions once stood. And centuries later, so too did invading armies, royal mail services, and scientific knowledge. The Renaissance didn't appear in isolation. It traveled. Even in decline, the Roman road whispered, "This is how to move through the world." Its design embedded certain expectations about time, distance, and reliability that later shaped the mental maps of medieval kings, early explorers, and Enlightenment thinkers. You could argue that the age of discovery began on Roman roads because they taught Europe that land could be mastered and mapped. Yet in many ways, the story of Roman roads is also a warning. The empire didn't fall because its roads failed. The roads outlasted it, but they could not save it. They were arteries without a heart, silent, impassive. They did not revolt, innovate, or govern. They only endured. The labor that built them, the quarrymen, the surveyors, the ditch diggers, had no say in what those roads were used for. Trade, war, oppression, or salvation. Stone does not choose. There's something both humbling and haunting about that. How much of what we build today will still shape the world when our own systems collapse? When our languages fade, our politics fracture, when asphalt cracks and metal rusts? Will the ghost of our labor still guide the future? In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists rediscovered many of these ancient routes. Some were traced by looking at patterns of old hedgerows. Others appeared as faint lines in aerial photographs. Still others emerged during construction, revealed when digging for pipes or railways. Always the discovery brought the same astonishment. It's still here. In some places, workers unknowingly built new roads over old ones, repaving, not replacing. In others, hikers still walk the silent, moss-covered stones. Their boots echo, faintly where once marched Roman legionaries, then medieval pilgrims, then Napoleonic troops. The road does not care who treads it, only that it is tread. And so, here at the end of our story, we return not to a grand battle or royal decree, but to a single stone in the dust, worn smooth by centuries, set by hands long dead, placed not for glory, but because it needed to be placed. This is the labor you never see, the hands that lifted, the feet that trampled, the minds that mapped the terrain, invisible now, but still beneath us. The Roman road did not last because of magic. It lasted because someone got up in the morning, picked up a tool, and did their job well, over and over, across generations, not for applause, not for statues, but because a stone, properly placed, might hold its place in the world long after. The one who placed it has vanished, and maybe that's the real legacy, not the empire, not the generals, but the ground. What forgotten infrastructure is our age building now, quietly, without attention, that might shape the lives of those we'll never meet? It begins with a quiet road. Perhaps it is late autumn. The wind, chilled and low, brushes dry leaves across packed earth, and there is no sound of wheels or hooves, only the hush of countryside before dusk. Alongside this narrow road, worn, rutted and pocked with years of rain, is a low timber building with a sagging roof, moss-clung walls, and smoke creeping lazily from a single chimney. If you were a traveller in the 13th century, this may have been your stop for the night. Welcome to the medieval inn. These places, humble, draughty, uneven, and often half-rotten, were the lifeblood of travel in medieval Europe, not because they were luxurious or even comfortable, but because they were there, where you could find food, drink, shelter, and, if luck allowed, an actual bed. But what was it truly like to step inside one of these inns, to walk in, cold and mud-footed, with the smell of wet hay and cheap ale rising up to meet you. Let us begin with the door. The entrance to a medieval inn wasn't grand. It was usually a wooden plank, roughly fitted, maybe with a squeaky iron hinge or a stiff wooden latch. It didn't keep much wind out, nor did it always keep animals in or out. Chickens wandered freely. Sometimes a dog dozed near the threshold. Inns often doubled as homes, stables, kitchens, and storage barns, and the boundaries between these spaces were blurred. Step inside, and you'd likely find a long common room, a central space shared by guests and innkeepers alike. Here the floor was not stone, nor was it neatly tiled. Most often it was earth, packed tightly from years of footsteps. It was sometimes strewn with rushes or straw, meant to soak up spills and waste, though in truth they only held on to them longer. The lighting was minimal. A few rushlights, dipped in tallow, cheap and smoky, flickered from wall-mounted holders. If the inn was better off, there might be a single iron chandelier with tallow candles hanging from the center beam. But mostly, it was the fire. One large hearth, open and central, with logs blackened and hissing as they dried. The hearth was both kitchen and heater, and it rarely burned clean. You could smell it before you saw much else. Smoke from damp wood, the scent of boiling barley, maybe dried fish or onions, maybe meat if it was a good night. But meat was expensive. More often, stews were made from cabbage, beans, root vegetables, and hard bread softened in broth. The innkeeper might be behind the fire, stirring with a wooden ladle. They were not chefs. They were not hosts in the modern sense. They were caretakers of a building meant to keep you dry, serve you something vaguely edible, and charge you for the privilege. It was a business, but a rough, precarious one. There was no official training, no chain of ownership, and no franchise. Inns were often little more than someone's large home, adapted over time to accommodate travelers. And in many towns, that meant it was the widow who had the space, or a merchant who needed coin, who ran the inn. There was no menu, not in the way we think of it now. Food was whatever could be made that day. Ale was brewed on site, in open, barrels, or reused jugs, and its quality could vary wildly from inn to inn, or even day to day. There were no regulations on cleanliness, and ale, being safer than water due to the brewing process, was consumed not just by travellers, but by children, priests, labourers, and everyone in between. Now picture the benches, wooden, low, uneven. They circled the hearth. You'd sit next to strangers, other travellers, pilgrims, farmers on the road. Conversation was often minimal, sometimes in different dialects, or even different languages. Sleep was on the mind, warmth and safety. Because for all the discomforts of an inn, the cold draughts, the muddy floors, the bad food, it was still a place behind walls, a place where bandits were less likely to strike, a place with other people who, like you, wanted to reach morning. The sleeping arrangements, however, were another matter entirely. Most inns had no individual rooms for guests. Private quarters were reserved for the rare noble who might pass through and pay handsomely. For the average traveller, sleeping meant a shared space, either above the common room in a low-beamed loft, or right there beside the fire, shoulder to shoulder with strangers. There were no clean sheets. If there was a mattress, it was stuffed with hay or straw. Often people slept on the floor itself, cloaked in whatever they carried. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice were regular company. The idea of hygiene, at least in the modern sense, was not present. Water was cold, rare, and not used for bathing unless absolutely necessary. Sometimes the stables were warmer. If the common room was full, and many were by nightfall, travellers might sleep among the horses, a blanket on hay, the scent of manure and animals, the warmth of breath rising from sleeping mules. It was not considered shameful. It was simply part of life on the road. Payment varied, and not always in coin. A labourer might offer help with chopping wood. A merchant might barter goods. Sometimes a bed was offered in exchange for silence, or for news from another village. Inns were trading posts as much as they were shelters, and so, with a belly of warm broth and a mug of sharp ale, a traveller would settle in for the night, wrapped in cloak, boots still on, back to the fire or curled in a corner. The sounds of night came slowly, the pop of logs, the wheeze of wind through wooden walls, the soft breathing of others, and sometimes a cough, sometimes a cry from a bad dream. The closeness of so many lives in a single space created its own rhythm. You could hear every shift, every sigh. But you were not on the road anymore. That mattered most. And in the stillness, as the fire dimmed, you might find yourself wondering, not just when you'd reach your destination, but how many others had passed through here before. How many feet had worn the door threshold smooth. How many stories were soaked into the walls. Because inns, though often dismissed in the histories of kings and castles, were the arteries of the world. Without them, the messages stopped. The merchants failed. The pilgrims never arrived. And though they were full of smoke and lice and watery ale, they held Europe together, one night at a time. But who were the people who kept these places running? Who swept the floors, stirred the stew, refilled the rushlights, and cleaned the straw beds after dozens had slept in them? In Section 2, we will begin to uncover the lives of the innkeepers, serving boys, alewives, and cleaners, those whose labour made medieval inns possible, though history rarely remembers their names. If you had lingered in the common room after dusk, if you had sat quietly near the hearth long after others had wrapped themselves in cloaks and leaned against the wall for sleep, you might have seen her. A woman in her middle years, face worn by weather and wood smoke, gathering empty jugs and half-chewed crusts from the floor. Her hands rough, her sleeves damp at the edges. She didn't speak. She knew where everything was. The ashes to bank, the shutters to bolt, the back door to wedge shut with a rock. She was the one you paid, if you paid, and the one who knew what to do when someone coughed too hard in the night, or when a rat was heard scuttling behind the ale barrels. She was the innkeeper, or at least one version of her. In medieval Europe, the word innkeeper did not always conjure a bearded man behind a bar, polishing a mug and spinning stories. More often than not, especially in smaller villages and roadside stations, the innkeeper was a woman, sometimes widowed, sometimes managing a property that belonged to her husband or son, sometimes running it alone. These women were the backbone of the travel economy. They brewed the ale, prepared the meals, collected payments, repaired the beds, and managed whatever help they could afford. There were no ledgers, not usually. Everything was remembered, passed by word, and kept going through sheer repetition. Their job was not glamorous, nor was it restful. Mornings began before sunrise, with firewood to chop, stew pots to scrape, spilled ale to mop. Water had to be fetched, usually from a nearby stream or well, and it took several heavy buckets just to soak enough oats for porridge or feed a few tired mules. And then there were the animals. Unless the inn was in a bustling town with dedicated grooms and farriers, the animals stayed close. They had to be watered, brushed and fed, especially in winter when hay ran short. Horses were money. A traveller's horse was often worth more than anything he carried, and a horse lamed by poor care could end the journey entirely. The boy in charge of this work, if the innkeeper had one, was often no more than 10 or 12. His name might not be remembered. He might not even have a name in the records, but he was there. In the morning, sweeping the stable floor with a bundle of straw, hauling feed in a crooked wooden bucket, wiping muck from the hooves of tired animals. He might also empty the chamber pots, because that too was part of life at an inn. There was no indoor plumbing. At best, there was a privy, a hole over a trench, located behind the building, exposed to weather and smells and flies. But if it rained, or snowed, or if guests were too tired to walk out in the dark, they used a ceramic or wooden pot. Someone had to carry those outside come morning, clean them, dump them behind the hedgerow or into the town's waste trench. The job often fell to the youngest helper, perhaps an orphan, perhaps a local child in need of food and lodging. The work was thankless, but it meant survival. It meant a place to sleep, even if it was on old sacks near the fireplace. Then there were the serving girls. In some inns, they were daughters. In others, they were hired hands, or indentured workers serving out a family debt. They moved quietly, carried wooden trenchers of food, poured ale from jugs, cleared crumbs, and listened to every word in the room. They had to, because inns weren't just resting places, they were listening posts. Gossip flowed more freely than ale. Travellers spoke of markets, wars, births, deaths, and royal changes. Inn workers became unofficial chroniclers. They knew who was headed where, what crops had failed, what borderlands were restless. Sometimes they heard too much. There are records, few, faint, buried in legal scrolls, of women accused of loose tongues or public slanders, their only crime being the sharing of what they'd heard over months of sweeping and serving. Knowledge, especially for women in a tightly controlled society, was both power and risk. But without these women, the inns would not have functioned. They brewed the ale. In many places, especially outside major cities, commercial brewing was rare. Ale was brewed in-house, often once or twice a week. The alewife, sometimes the innkeeper herself, sometimes a dedicated brewmistress, prepared the malt, boiled the mash, cooled the wort, and pitched the yeast, usually handed down from batch to batch. It was not exact science. Temperatures were guessed by touch, strength judged by taste. Brewing took hours, and the results were inconsistent. Sour one week, flat the next. But it was still safer to drink than water, which was often contaminated from runoff, waste, or nearby cesspits. The alewife also served. She'd carry foaming jugs to tables where travellers slouched, still dusted in road dirt. She'd dodge elbows, arguments, and sudden fights. Not all travellers were peaceful. Soldiers with coin could be loud. Pilgrims with blisters could be short-tempered. And not every visitor arrived with honest intentions. This made the job dangerous. Some inns were protected by proximity to town watchmen. Others were not. The innkeeper had to rely on favours, on knowledge of local toughs, or sometimes on her own sharp tongue and sharper broomstick to keep order. Locks were rare. Most doors used latches or bars. Windows were wooden shutters. There was no bell to summon help, yet these women endured. They did the accounts, if only in memory. They knew which customers to trust, which faces to avoid. They stored dried apples behind the hearth for winter, salted beans in cloth sacks, counted coins by feel and sound, and somehow they kept the whole thing running. These inns were more than shelter. They were little economies. The stew pot wasn't just for guests. It fed the staff, the family, the stray cat. Leftover ale was poured into baking. Scraps went to pigs or to the compost heap behind the stable. Linens were patched, not replaced. Broken jugs became scoops. Firewood was gathered, not bought. Everything was used, reused, and repurposed. Waste was a luxury no one could afford, and through it all, the inn lived. Boards creaked. Walls leaned. But the fire stayed lit. The straw was replaced. Travelers came, slept, and left. And the people who made this possible, who received little praise or record, stood behind it all, broom in hand, apron stained, hair pinned under a linen cap. These were not the people history books usually mention. But without them, nothing moved. Not soldiers, not traders, not priests or kings. The world needed beds, bowls, and boiling pots more than it needed banners. Inns were homes for those between homes. But what happened when the road became dangerous? When plague, war, or famine struck? In Section 3, we'll explore how medieval inns adapted, or didn't, during the worst times, when travellers stopped coming, when diseases spread, and when the threat outside was greater than anything in the common room. There were seasons when the road went quiet, when the dust no longer stirred beyond the hedgerows, and the distant clop of hooves faded into memory. The shutters stayed closed, the fire burned lower, and the stew pot, which once simmered with bones and barley, hung empty over cold ash. What happens to an inn when no one travels? Plague, war, famine. These were not abstract threats. They came often, and they came close. The Black Death alone, when it swept across Europe in the 14th century, shut down not only cities but the entire rhythm of travel. And inns, those quiet thresholds between places, felt the silence more than most. Picture it. A small village inn, tucked between a smithy and a stream. It had been busy the week before. 2 merchants from York, a tinker with a 3-legged dog, and a nun on her way to a convent. But today, no one comes, and then tomorrow, still nothing. By the 3rd day, the bread isn't baked. By the 5th, the ale barrel is left untapped. The innkeeper sends her boy to the edge of town to listen, for news, and he returns with a whisper, plague. When plague came, the door stayed shut. At first it was caution. No one wanted to be the place where infection took hold. But soon, it was survival. People stopped trusting strangers. A coughing traveller might carry death. A coin passed between hands might spread disease. Inns, once a symbol of welcome, became risk. Some were boarded up completely. The innkeeper, if she had family, retreated behind barred windows, rationing beans and dried apples. The dog, if it hadn't run off, slept near the hearth. Rats moved more freely now. The straw in the stable began to mould. Horses, once a steady source of income, were no longer a safe bet. Who would ride and where? Others stayed open. Cautiously. They hung sprigs of herbs above the doors. Rue, rosemary, tansy, believed to ward off the sickness. Bowls of vinegar were placed on windowsills. Travellers were made to wash with lye water. Some inns cut slits in the shutters to serve food without opening the door. It wasn't science, but it was effort. Still, fear weighed heavy. Records from the time mention towns forbidding inns from housing strangers. In some places, people who offered lodging to outsiders were fined or even punished. The line between hospitality and hazard blurred. Survival meant suspicion. Inns adapted if they could. Some pivoted to serve their own village. They became soup, kitchens of a kind, offering bread and pottage to locals who had nothing left. Others stored grain for barons or church officials. A few were commandeered entirely, turned into quarantine stations or lodging for sick priests. But the cost was great. Without travellers, income dried up. Ale brewing ceased. Beds lay empty. Floorboards cracked and curled in the damp. The serving. Girl found herself sweeping less and praying more. The boy with the chamber pots now carried firewood to neighbours instead, trying to earn scraps. In war, things were different, but no easier. Inns were strategic. Armies needed food, shelter, and information. That meant inns. A roadside inn might suddenly find itself hosting 30 men, hungry and armed, with little coin and no interest in permission. Bread was seized, ale drained. The innkeeper might be paid days later, if at all, or might be left, with broken mugs and a scarred door. This was not rare. In fact, during the 100 Years' War and other prolonged campaigns, entire regions saw their inns gutted by passing soldiers. Walls were burned for firewood. Chickens vanished. Horses were taken, and yet the innkeeper stayed. Where else was there to go? Even in wartime, people needed to eat. Soldiers still wanted news, rest, something warm in their hands. Some innkeepers negotiated. They hosted officers, kept notes, smiled at the right moment. They were not traitors, but they were survivors. A few inns prospered, carefully. They catered to mercenaries, rented beds by the hour to scouts, cooked rich stews from salted beef meant for lean times. But these were rare. Most inns merely endured, quietly, stubbornly, through fear and fatigue. And then there was famine. Hunger changes everything. When crops failed, whether from poor weather, pestilence, or war, so did the food chain. Inns that once served bread and broth now stretched thin meals over thin coin. The stew pot contained more water, fewer beans. The ale was sour and weak. Yet travellers still came, desperate ones, pilgrims with nothing but sandals and hunger, mothers carrying sick children, beggars with hollow eyes. The inn could not feed them all, nor could it turn them all away. Some inns resorted to barter. A half-rotten apple traded for a place on the floor, a cloak stitched in exchange for stale bread. The inn became less a business, more a node in a strained, fragile web of need. But hunger had no mercy. If the innkeeper had stored enough grain, hidden perhaps behind the smokehouse wall, she might last the season. If not, she shared in the hunger. Her children grew thinner. The dog whined more often. Fires were lit with broken stools. Beds were sold piece by piece, and yet the door remained. Perhaps only open a crack, but open, because the innkeeper knew something others didn't. The road always returns, even after plague, even after war, even when famine bends backs and quiets songs. The road remains, and so the inn does too. When the danger passed, the shutters were opened again, tables scrubbed, barrels patched. The first traveller in months was offered a cracked mug of thin ale and a smile, genuine, tired, and full of hope. Because even in silence, the inn remembers its purpose. It is not only a place of food or fire, it is a thread in the fabric of human need. A space between movement, a pause between lives. The quiet hearth beside a door that always, eventually, swings open again. But who were the travellers who returned first? And why did they trust the road again? In Section 4, we'll follow the journey of a medieval traveller, from saddlebag to supper bowl, and all the invisible choices made in between. You've been walking for hours. The light has gone soft and golden, and your legs feel as though they're carrying buckets of stone. A drizzle begins, not a downpour, just enough to soak the wool of your cloak and cling to the leather of your boots. But up ahead, where the road bends past a low wall of stacked stone, a faint trail of smoke curls skyward. You see it, the dark outline of a timber frame, the slouch of a thatched roof, a glow in a small window. It's an inn. You're not quite relieved yet, but you're closer. Medieval travel was not romantic. It was slow, uncertain, and often punishing. Roads were deeply rutted or disappeared entirely, and wayfinding was based on oral directions, half-erased signposts, or sheer memory. For most travellers, a good inn was less a luxury than a form of rescue. You reach the doorway. Sometimes you'd knock with your knuckles or boot heel. In other places, a bell or iron ring might be present. But even without sound, the innkeeper usually knew you were there. Dogs barked, shutters creaked, footsteps travelled easily over packed earth. Then comes the judgment. The door cracks open. A face appears, weathered, wary, eyes sharp. The innkeeper looks you over in one practiced sweep. Are you armed? Are you sick? Are you likely to pay? She decides. The door swings wider. Inside, the inn smells of stale smoke, boiled grain, damp wood. If you're lucky, there's the smell of cooking, a faint stew, onions and turnips maybe, perhaps salted pork if it's a feast day. There is no reception desk, there is no menu, but there is warmth, and right now, that is enough. You step inside, your shoulders relaxing only slightly. The innkeeper gestures to a bench by the fire. You sit. Your boots squelch against the packed earthen floor. Another figure sits nearby, a traveller like you, nodding politely but not speaking. It is safer that way. Your first concern: food. Inns rarely served individualized meals. Instead, a single pot of pottage might simmer all day, available for a fee. The longer you arrived after midday, the thinner the contents. You take what's left. If you're very fortunate, you're offered trencher bread. Thick slices of coarse, stale loaves used as edible plates. Gravy soaks into the dense crumb. After the meal, it's eaten or thrown to dogs, or the poor. You drink what there is. Ale, more often than not. Weak, cloudy, sometimes tart. Stronger drink costs more and is served sparingly. If you're at a wealthier inn, there might be cider. Rarely, wine. If you're on a trade route or very close to a monastery, there are no spoons unless you brought one. So you slurp. You tilt the bowl. You use crusts of bread. You pay in coin if you have it, or barter if you don't. A cobbler might offer a repair, a peddler, a few pins or ribbon. Barter was common, and innkeepers learned to value tools over promises. Once, fed, your thoughts turn to lodging. A bed, if there is one, is shared, not just by couples or families, but by strangers. Beds were expensive, space was limited, and warmth was worth the awkwardness. 4 to a bed was not unusual, sometimes more. You might be given a spot on the floor, or a top straw in the corner, or, if you're particularly lucky, a space in the loft where the heat rises. The straw may be clean, or not. It depends how long since the last guest had lice. Your belongings. You sleep with them. Satchels, purses, knives, all kept close. Theft was not constant, but it was never impossible. As night deepens, the fire dims. Voices soften. Rats scurry. Somewhere in the back, the stable creaks. Horses shifting, ropes tugging. Outside, a dog barks once, then falls quiet. This was the rhythm of rest on the road. No lullaby, no privacy, no guarantee of quiet, but shelter, but stillness, but something close to safe. The next morning, you leave early. Guests are not encouraged to linger. The hearth is raked clean, the bowl washed and set aside. The innkeeper returns to their chores, cutting kindling, skimming curdled milk, mending the torn mat in the doorway. Another traveller may come, or not. But your place is gone. The warmth you left behind will cool in minutes. Your face forgotten by midday. You leave a coin or a promise, and then you are back on the road, into the wind, the dirt, the long stretch of unknown. This was the invisible dance of travel and shelter in the medieval world. One foot in front of the other, one threshold to the next, but behind every traveller is a horse, or mule, or donkey, and that brings us to the real work behind the stable doors. In Section 5, we step into the world of the inn stables, the grooms, the hay, the manure, and the long, unromantic duty of caring for tired beasts. Before you ever smelled the stew or sipped the ale, your horse smelled the hay. It had picked up its pace on approach, less because of instinct and more because it knew. Long before you learned to spot an inn by its thatched eaves or crooked signboard, your animal recognized the sound of hoofbeats within, the scent of dry feed, the soft rustle of straw. The stables were the first test of whether an inn was truly good. You might be traveling on horseback or guiding a cart. Perhaps you lead a mule or a donkey. Whatever the beast, it needs shelter, feed, water, and someone to keep it alive through the night. At the rear of most medieval inns, or tucked alongside the main building, the stables stood slumped in their own atmosphere, damp, warm, rich with the scent of manure and hay dust, always active. There, a stable hand worked quietly, never in fine clothes, always with sleeves rolled, boots caked in layers of straw, filth, and effort. His hands were chapped, and his back sore, but he rarely spoke unless spoken to. His job was simple, continuous, and invisible. He took your reins, sometimes for a small coin, other times out of habit or the hope of leftovers. He led your horse past the half-split gate, over the uneven flooring, between rows of wooden partitions where other horses already stood chewing, stamping, or dozing. First, water. The bucket wasn't always clean, but it was cold. Drawn from a well or scooped from a barrel left to settle overnight, the water was hauled daily in staggering repetition. Good inns had deep wells. Lesser inns relied on nearby streams. If winter had frozen the bucket, the boy might thaw it near the hearth, or simply crack the surface and serve it as is. Then, feed, oats, if the inn was generous, bran and chaff, more likely. Occasionally, a mash of soaked grains, fed in a shallow trough, or a linen sack tied around the nose. Hay was offered, too, coarse, dry, and often yellowed with age. It wasn't luxury, but it filled the gut. Your horse snorted once, steam curling from its nostrils. If you had the coin, you might pay for brushing. The stable hand would move quickly, using a coarse cloth, not a brush, and working around the saddle sore spots with practiced care. If you didn't pay, no one brushed. The beast dried in its own sweat and dust. Some inns offered a stall. Many simply offered space. The floor was packed earth, sometimes covered with straw, often damp with old waste. Cleaning was periodic. A decent stable hand mucked twice daily, pitchforking dung into a growing pile outside, near the dung heap or the village midden. A bad one let it compact, day after day, until it crusted over and became indistinguishable. From the ground itself, your saddle was removed and hung on a peg, if there was one. If not, the floor sufficed. Rain leaked through thatch, rats chewed leather. If you were careful, you brought your gear inside the inn itself and slept with it beneath your feet. But the horse stayed out. Overnight, the stable sang a quiet, sour music. Low knickers, the clink of iron shoes shifting against cobbles, the slow breath of resting animals. Sometimes a goat bleated, sometimes dogs slept in the straw, and always there was the work. The stable hand checked hooves, pulled stones from frogs, patched a split strap. He rose before you and worked after you slept. He knew every horse in town, every traveller's habits, every cart and its axle strength. He was never praised, never painted, but the success of an inn rested in his hands. Hands that held muckrakes, bridles, and lives. If the stable was poor, your beast suffered. If your beast suffered, your journey ended. The innkeeper knew this, so they watched the hayloft, counted oats, paid the boy in crusts and cider. The work was invisible until it wasn't, until a horse collapsed or refused to move. Then all eyes turned to the stable. By dawn, the work began again. More water, fresh hay, another round of mucking, another rider at the gate, and yet even stables were not the lowest rung of the inn's invisible labour. Because while you ate and drank and your horse chewed straw, another figure worked behind the hearth wall, tending pots, scrubbing trenchers, and scouring ale mugs. In section 6, we'll peer into the scullery, where bread crusts were scraped, mutton bones boiled dry, and the quietest workers carried the weight of the entire inn on their tired, greasy backs. If you were lucky, you never saw the scullery. It wasn't a room, not really. More often, it was a corner, a dark, fire-warmed recess behind the hearth, tucked just out of sight. You might have glimpsed it if you passed through the kitchen, a shadowy alcove where the smoke hung lower, the air dampened by boiling pots, and the floor constantly slick beneath your feet. Here, the lowest-ranked workers moved, mostly women, sometimes boys. They worked with sleeves damp from elbow to wrist, hands red and swollen from long hours in cold water or scalding broth. Their eyes stung from onion fumes and ash smoke. Their aprons were stained with whatever soup or grease had boiled over that evening. If a trencher was wiped clean, they did it. If the rushes needed changing, they were the ones who pulled up the dirty straw. You didn't speak to them. Not out of rudeness, but because you barely noticed them. They worked at floor level, always kneeling, scrubbing, lifting. They came and went through the rear doors, hauling buckets, stacking trenchers, chasing rats. Their names weren't recorded. Their efforts were assumed. They kept the system running. Every cup you drank from, every bowl of stew, every clean pewter plate, they touched it first. Their arms carried it, cleaned it, dried it, and set it before you. No one toasted the scullery, but when a traveller whispered, "Good ale here," or smiled at a second helping of pottage, they were praising the invisible ones. The scullery's rhythm was slow and repetitive. Clean, heat, chop, scrub, empty the ashpan, mop the drippings, from beneath the spit. Turn the pot, stir the broth. Reheat the stale bread on a shovel held into the embers. Wipe the spilled cider from the table legs, and when all else was done, at the very end of the night, they boiled the bones. Whatever meat had been served that evening, the scraps were gathered, the rinds and peels and trimmings, and all of it went into the pot. It simmered overnight, low and slow, catching the last of the day's heat, becoming the base for tomorrow's stew. Nothing was wasted. Not labour, not bread, not even the ashes. The fire was never allowed to go out completely. In a good inn, someone would rake the embers gently before dawn, adding fresh kindling, whispering it back to life before the cock crowed. This work didn't earn coin. It earned crusts, a place to sleep, the protection of walls. For some, orphans, widows, abandoned girls, it was better than the alternative. For others, it was the only way in. A path to apprentice in the kitchen, to learn brewing, to eventually serve at table or tend the ledger. The scullery was both punishment and opportunity, and yet, even here, there was community. Quiet jokes passed, beneath the clang of pots, secrets traded over dishwater, a crust slipped to a hungry mouth, the knowing nod of one tired worker to another as they both wiped the same corner of the same table for the third time that night. This, more than the stew or ale, was what held the inn together. An unspoken agreement, labour for warmth, effort for belonging. When the doors creaked closed and the shutters were drawn, the inn was not silent. The hearth still glowed. The coals still cracked. And somewhere in the dimmest corner, someone was scrubbing a knife, drying their hands on a threadbare apron, and preparing to do it all again tomorrow. They were never written about in chronicles. Their names are gone, their lives unmarked by parchment or stone. But their hands fed travellers, quieted horses, and warmed the beds of countless souls who passed through without a second thought. And in that quiet cycle, day after day, they kept the Middle Ages stitched together. So as you drift now into sleep, think not of knights or battles, but of someone like you, kneeling beside a fire, scrubbing the handle of a spoon, humming a tune no one recorded, and ask yourself, without these hands, who would have eaten, who would have traveled, who would have survived?